Fancy Zicani.
We are...
Tell him stop. Come on, Clover. I tell him to stop. You have to carry water every day from the well to the new garden.
I won't. I carry him. Just tell him stop.
Agriculture, something that food is particularly close to my heart. Tomorrow I am going to be talking about human evolution, and that's a fun one because I'm going to show you some of the reconstructions of the different old apes that may be our ancestors and may not. And we'll take a look at what has been found. There's been some new skeletons found, especially in Ethiopia. And that I had a lot of fun working on that one and bringing that one up to date. So today, we're going to look at food and agriculture in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa in particular. This is my picture of Burkina Faso. And these are pictures of, we went in vans, rickety vans, and they were taken out of the window with bouncing around on the street. So they're not always as clean and crisp as some of the photographs may be. We go back to our biomes. In the African biomes, Africa has very regular in its ecology because of the Sahara and the Sahel. Then it goes to savanna, then it goes to the dark green area, which is the humid subtropical, then humid tropical, and then back the other way toward a temperate climate. And that makes it very easy for us to talk about the food and agriculture because each of the biomes has its own ecology and human beings adapted to that ecology very efficiently in each area. And surprisingly enough, it is in the Sahel, which is right between the Sahara and the savanna, that you've got a lot of human creative domestication of plants and animals taking place. And until recently, this was not something, it was not something that was attributed to Africans. In fact, the contribution of Africans to the international food system has been diminished over time, and that was in order to justify the continued exploitation of that environment. So what we have is a number of deserts, and the deserts are not agricultural, so the agricultural area of Africa is between those two deserts. And interestingly enough, in spite of what academics have tried to do is to diminish the contribution of Africans to world food, domestication on the various continents proceeded pretty much in a similar way. In other words, it seems that humans were almost programmed to do certain things as time went on and as our brain developed and our experience accumulated. We ended up domesticating plants. There are different plants in different areas, and these red spots are the areas of major domestication in the world. And you can see that West Africa, not only the Nile Valley, which is a little bit anomalous, which is why I don't talk about it, because it's also a controversial area of in its history, but Ethiopia and West Africa are definitely areas homes to major domestication of plants. And you can see the Americas also, and the Americas were isolated. They didn't have much contact with the rest of the world, although I just got an article yesterday, or a reference to an article that shows how the Andes were in connection, made connection with the Pacific on a regular basis, and the sweet potato went back and forth across, and it's been documented, and there was just a conference last week on that. So what we have is human beings who, no matter what you do, no matter where you are, human beings tend to be creative, and they will look at their environment and adjust it to benefit the group, to benefit the society in various ways. And one of the things that happens in the sub-Saharan area, and east to west all the way across Africa, is the domestication of cattle. And this cattle has now been mixed. They domesticated what is the Bos taurus, which is a humpless longhorn, and it's the Watusi cattle. Well, I'm going to show you some pictures. There's some really incredible animals that they have created. And that seems to be domesticated around 4000 BC. It was later mixed to some extent with introduced Asian cattle, which is Bos indicus, and that is the humped, it's called the Brahman cattle. We have it in the United States as well. This cattle does not give a lot of milk like the cattle in the United States and in Northern Europe, but it's very hardy and it survives in this climate extremely well, and it is very useful because in some cases it provides almost all the food for the population, especially in East Africa. The Watutsis, unlike the cattle that is in the Middle East and in other parts of the world, these people who domesticated the cattle did not engage in agriculture. And that is somewhat of a survival choice. If you've got the cattle, you can form a symbiotic relationship with agricultural peoples and you can trade. Watutsis, who are in East Africa, actually live off their cattle. They use the cattle blood as well as the milk. They mix it, and that is their main food, as well as it is supplemented by hunting and gathering in order to vary their diet. And the Watutsis love to breed their cattle to have the most elaborate horns, and they all compete with each other for cattle that has elaborate horns. Whether this cattle is more productive or not is open to question. It doesn't seem that the beauty of the horns has much to do with the production of milk. It is not used for meat in general. You get downers and boners, which are the culled cattle, and that will be eaten. But in general, they are not meat. The people are not meat eaters. They drink the milk and they drink the blood. And these are prize-winning. They have local competitions, and these are the prize-winning guys from there. Now the Watutsi and the Maasai, these are Maasai guys. Maasais are known for this jumping that they do, leaping into the air, and that is also very competitive. This guy is leaping into the air. They're very tall, very thin, and they love living out in the bush, in the savannah. It's and the Sahel is kind of a transitional zone, and they love their cattle. They love spending their time with the cattle. They have no intention of getting involved in agriculture or taking a 9-to-5 job and sitting in front of a computer all day. They extend from Nubia all the way down to Tanzania, and that they move with their herds. And they have to move with their herds because they're not creating pasture and they're not creating field lots. So what happens when you take your cattle to a place, eventually they will eat it bone dry. And ecologically, that could be a disaster. And before that happens, they will move to another place. They're called transhuman nomads. Transhuman nomads are nomads who move in a circle. Afghans have always been transhuman nomads, and that's a very difficult concept for settled people to understand, because these people don't accept national borders, and they will make relationships with people across the border speaking several languages, and every year they will come through, and the cattle will then fertilize the fields, and the farmers depend on these transhuman nomads to come through their area, and they will then trade agricultural goods. They live in their own types of villages, which they can easily pack up and move out whenever they need. They will spend a certain amount of time, and it's always a predictable cycle, a predictable amount of time, and the farmers know them, and the cattle guys know the farmers. These are relationships that have formed over hundreds, if not thousands of years. In Central Africa, you have the locally domesticated cattle. The Maasai cattle are now mixed. They're mixed with Asian cattle, but these are pretty much pure local cattle. They're very well adapted to the environment, and they move around just like the Maasai, just like the Eastern cattle. They are mixed with cattle that was introduced 2,000 to 4,000 years ago from India and Pakistan, called the Zebu cattle, which is also related to the Brahman cattle of various kinds. Now there are some problems in Africa that they have to overcome, and these problems inhibit production or reduce production and reduce human health, and one is the tsetse fly. The tsetse fly infects many individuals. It infects cattle. It has to go through a certain cycle. It is what is called sleeping sickness. And it does cause havoc with the human populations as well as cattle populations. So you can understand that when the domestication of agriculture came about, you had these cattle areas, and the cattle were in the Sahel. They were domesticated earlier, and then you had agricultural domestication. People gave up cattle because the cattle in this area were not doing very well, and they got involved in agriculture, and that is when the Bantu expansion came. It came with the development of agriculture, and agriculture came with the development of iron smelting, because that improved the tools that could produce food, and they could produce more food. So agriculture was kind of a hedge against the tsetse fly and some of the parasites. Now, because this is the cradle of human evolution, when we evolved, our ancestors evolved at sub-Saharan Africa, we evolved after a lot of the parasites evolved. Malaria is 50 million years old. The human and our species, not our previous species, but our species is about 300,000 years old, possibly a little more. But that means that we post-date the tsetse fly, malaria, and some of the parasites. And that is why, in a sense, when humans got out 100,000 years ago, humans walked out of Africa and went into the Middle East and then went into Asia, they could expand. The population expanded extremely rapidly because there were none of those parasites that had predated our species and our relations, our cousins. Now, unusually, in Guinea-Bissau, they found a type of cattle. There was a DNA study done recently, in the last 10 years, by the Belgians all over 23 countries in Africa. And in Guinea-Bissau, they found these Ndama cattle. And these have a resistance to sleeping sickness, to the tsetse fly, and they can't pass it on. And so, but They don't give as much milk, and they're skinny. I've seen them in Guinea-Bissau. People have them, but they prefer to get the bigger cattle because they're more productive. So they're talking about, scientists are talking about ways of combining them and crossbreeding them in order to get some of the disease resistance from these guys into the more productive cattle. So in the West, you had the Fulani. Remember the guys with the pointy hats? If you see them, you might see some in Ghana. If you see a guy with a hat like this, he's a Fulani, and he's there because he brought his cattle somewhere to a farm to clean the farm and to fertilize it with his cattle, and then he's going to go back to his homestead. And this is up here on the left, you have the Fulani area of the Sahel, and these guys are the transhuman nomads. They have to cross the Niger River, and they have to cross during the rainy season various muddy places. And handling this cattle, it's obviously not easy. It's a skill, and they work hard at it. So agriculture then starts in a lot of the domestication started in the Sahel, in the very dry areas, but then continued to be developed in the tropical savanna, which is a very large area. It's the largest area of agriculture probably in all of Africa, and it is here that you get the major production of agriculture to this day. This is what the savanna looks like. It is not Tarzan country. And that was a real disappointment to me when I first went. I expected to see him just leaping across, but no, the trees won't hold up to that kind of use. But the savanna, as dry as it looks, and it is fairly dry, but what the Africans have done is they have selected seeds and plants that will grow and will produce in this particular environment. Domestication of plants in West Africa, the list is incredibly long. And it has been denigrated, it has been shortened, there's been a lot of argument. There's people who have argued and said, no, these weren't domesticated in Africa, and now they're finding out and really substantiating that, yes, these plants, many of these plants were domesticated in Africa. There are also plants that were introduced, and I'll show you a little bit of the difference, but some of these you've never heard of, and I've never heard of. In fact, some of these I've never seen. If anyone's interested, you can probably go to the market and ask them to, the plants, you'll get a name that's local, and you won't be able to figure it out. You can take a photograph and bring it to a botanist and hope that they can identify the plant, but you know, these are tremendously important because it created, the sub-Saharan diet has tremendous variety, although it has a very different approach to meals and cooking from what we are used to in Europe and in the European parts of North America. So here you have the areas of the different plants that were domesticated, and oddly enough, they are domesticated in the areas of the toughest ecological zones. So you've got some pretty creative human beings working away, doing plant selection in these areas in order to survive and thrive. And after the next talk, we're going to be talking about the kingdoms of Africa, which depended on much of this agriculture. and these kingdoms are right here, right in this area. So this domestication is what led to the development of some very, very interesting and very advanced civilizations in Africa. African food is grain-based, a lot of it. They do not eat traditionally a lot of meat. The meat is used for, the animals are used for milk, and they're used to fertilize the agricultural fields. By passing through those fields, the nomads are fertilizing the fields and contributing to the agriculture that is going to feed the people. And this is an efficient system, because it takes 18 pounds of grain to produce 1 pound of meat if you're going to be a meat eater. So in terms of feeding people on a very small budget, it's better for people to eat grain as their major staple than to eat meat as their staple. So you've got the markets. What am I doing there? Oh, I missed it. And now you've got, at the time when agriculture is being developed, the iron is starting to be smelted. People have now discovered the smelting of iron, and it's considered, well, I still have 1,200 BC, but it's been pushed back. It's been pushed back to about 4,000 BC, and I suspect it's going to be pushed back even further. In Luanda, I and several people went to the museum. I had remembered an iron smelter from before. I wanted to take another picture of it and look at it a little more carefully, but unfortunately they had lost the key to the room, so we couldn't see it. So iron smelting, all of a sudden in West Africa, it created a whole new technology that made agriculture much more efficient. And that coincides with the Bantu movement down into southern Africa. They're getting away from the tsetse fly. They're getting away from the need for the heavy dependence on cattle, although they're still taking their cattle with them. But now they're depending more and more on agricultural production for survival. In the meantime, the blacksmith becomes, because of this importance, the blacksmith becomes also a very important ritual individual, because like we talked about yesterday, he not only produces beautiful pieces of art, but he makes it possible for agriculture to become more and more efficient. And these are the guys who innovate. And they get to a different place. As the migrations continue, the soils change. So the blacksmiths have to adapt. They have to adapt the technology. So basically the blacksmith becomes the innovator of the different technologies that are used for survival, and he's got his assistants. This is Burkina Faso when I went through it, and these are houses that the people there are all mixed. This is Fulani houses. These are temporary dwellings of the transhuman nomads who have come because the harvest has been taken in. Now the Fulani are going to come in, and they're going to fertilize the fields with their cattle, and this is what their temporary village looks like. And next year they're going to come back, they're going to fix up these houses, they're going to stay there, or they may go to a different village in different places. This was just at the time when I was there. It was just after harvest, so the cattle had not arrived yet, but this is what the savannah looks like at the time. To me, it looks very dry, but to them it looks very productive. They were very satisfied with the harvest that that happened that year. The Sahel is a low rainfall, dry area, and the plants that were domesticated in West Africa were domesticated and adapted to the particular rainfall of each of the biomes. And in the driest area of the Sahel is where we got the millet and sorghum, which can grow on practically no water whatsoever. It needs a little, but not much. And this was an area of very high production. Pearl millet was domesticated 3,000 years ago and possibly more. Actually, all of the literature and the studies push the dates back, so by the time I prepare this, I put this out, the dates have all been pushed back. But it is incredibly well adapted to this type of environment, and this means that people worked at it. They selected these seeds. They selected it, they knew what they were doing. They weren't just fiddling around playing with the seeds, hit or miss. These are people who seed selection is a science, and farmers know that science. They created it, actually. So you've got different types of millet. The millet is very much, it tastes very much like any grain, like it's rice or a barley or, whoops, it went backwards. And you have different varieties which are adapted to the different ecological zones within the areas, and they provided the staple foods and still provide the staple foods, particularly in the area of Senegal. Some of this you see here, the finger millet is now, they think it goes back to 5,000 years ago, and that it was one of the earliest domesticated millets. Sorghum is also a locally early domesticated plant, also in the Sahel, also is very drought tolerant and provides food in areas of low rainfall. This is actually corn. She's growing corn. This area is not very well adapted to corn, although they do grow corn because they do like the taste of the corn. But 70% of all agricultural production in sub-Saharan Africa is done by women. And 65% of the potential is actually producing 65% of what they could produce, even given the technology that they are using today, not even putting a tractor out there. That's UN statistics and UN. So what the concept, because you've got a grain-based diet, and you have not only grain, but you have root crops, it is a totally different approach to meal selection. And one of the problems they have is, of course, fuel for cooking. There is no wood, not much wood. The savannah is not exactly a place where you can go and collect a lot of wood. So they do have a system of cooking that is basically a one-pot meal. And that works very well. They also plan their meals in a different way through the day. They plan their meal, the main meal is in the middle of the day, and it is supposed to last the person eating at least 10 or 12 hours or into the time when they're going to go to bed at night. And we'll look at this. in a little bit more detail. This is a typical dish with sorghum and millet is cooked very much like rice is cooked. And you have a yam or a sweet potato and some small greens, which I don't know what those are. The UN is trying to help the fuel shortage by introducing a stove which locally called Chango Chango Moto. And this can reduce the amount of wood that is used for cooking by at least 3 times. So that instead of going to collect wood 3 times a week, the women can go 1 time a week and they have enough to spend in cooking. And they really like this. This is a very efficient way of cooking. Interestingly enough, I worked in Bangladesh with women in the agricultural villages. This is very similar to the kinds of stoves that you find in India and in Bangladesh, and very similar to the type of cooking that's done on a table hearth by the Maya in Central America. Their cooking is a 1-dish meal. It is generally a stew made with something to flavor the vegetables, and oftentimes there's no meat. Sometimes there's little chunks of meat. But the main food is that carbohydrate. And that carbohydrate in West Africa is called fufu, and you will see it in Ghana tomorrow. So look for it. I'll show you where you can find it and where you can see it. But that is a kind of a mashed potato type of paste that forms the basic staple that is then used to eat with this sauce. And if we look at several different examples of foods, this is a millet stew and fried food next to it, and these are all based on the agricultural grains that provides the major calories humans need. We calculate per capita about 3,500 calories per capita. That means, children will have less. Men and women who work hard with their bodies will need more, but that's just kind of a rule of thumb that we use. But and that calorie count in sub-Saharan Africa comes mainly from the grains and mainly from the carbohydrates. Humans, contrary to what we believe in the United States particularly, don't need a whole lot of protein. And if you are calorie deficient, any protein that you eat will be used by your body as calories for energy. It will be wasted. So if you are depending on your calories for beef, for instance, and that beef or that pork was made by 1 pound was made by 18 pounds of grain, you don't have a lot of money, you're using your resources more efficiently if you eat it as grain. And this is what is happening in most of Africa. Now, West Africa, this is an interesting story. West Africa has this jollof rice, which was domesticated. It is now agreed by the Wolof people of Senegal. It is an indigenous rice. Now, the last time I gave this talk, it was not considered domesticated in Africa. They were arguing that it was domesticated in Asia, introduced into the Carolinas, into the United States, became Uncle Ben's Carolina rice, and was reintroduced into Senegal. And now we know that that's a bunch of crock. that was a theory with no scientific basis whatsoever. And yes, it was introduced into Carolina, and it is the Carolina rice, but it is a rice domesticated in West Africa and especially in Senegal. And it is very similar to Asian rice in its taste. And here you have something like a yam stew with a rice on the bottom. This is a typical village of the Sahel, a Wolof village, and these are the people who domesticated the Jollof rice that is now introduced into the United States as well. In order to grow that rice, aside from the DNA studies that have been done on the rice itself and its varieties, is that they found canals, not only modern canals, but ancient canals that were used to irrigate that rice when there was the little bit of rainfall in that area that happens. So we know that rice now, we're pretty certain that rice was domesticated in Senegal area by the Wolof people. There's also yams, and what used to be said that yams were domesticated in the Americas, and that used to be said like 4 years ago. Now it is pretty much accepted that yams are domesticated in Africa. They are indigenous to Africa, and who knows, I, not being an expert in this area, in another year I might be saying something else that they're not, but right now science is pretty much agreed that there is a node, a center of domestication in Africa. There seems to be also a center of domestication in Asia, so it's still an area of debate. But the African yam has very low protein value, but very high carbohydrate value. So it has a lot of calories, and that is what most people need most. They need calories. And they can grow huge yams, and these yams are celebrated in Nigeria. They've had yam festivals for many, many years. Here is what the botanical plant, the yam, looks like. This is not a sweet potato. The sweet potato is Peruvian and South American, and it was introduced in Polynesia. Yams are incredibly important food, and they are used to flavor the stews that then have the rest of the vegetables cooked into it. So you can see there's grains, and now there's root crops, and these are one-pot meals. So they've got the grains and the root crops all cooked into a stew form, and then in this dish they've actually put in the peanut, and the peanut is 45% protein or 40% protein, and has a lot of fat in it, and so that adds the superfood. It creates and makes it into a superfood. And there is, when they make millet, they will make a porridge out of the millet, and they have fermented milk, and fermentation is a way of preservation, and so that they don't need refrigeration to preserve the fermented foods. But as you can see, the African foods, the sub-Saharan foods, being super nutritious, they don't have a lot of eye appeal. So you go to a restaurant, and it's very difficult to put something like this, especially if you've got an overfed population, like you do in the United States. This isn't exactly the food that you could introduce into Minneapolis and say, you know, we do have several African restaurants and they do serve this type of food, but people have to be very careful because in our society we have a surfeit of calories and a surfeit of fats. These people have less than they need. They need more carbohydrates and they need more fats. So these foods are perfectly well adapted to this type of environment, but they're not adapted to our type of environment. Peanuts are very, very important all through Africa, and particularly in Ghana. Peanut stew is a Ghanaian dish. Peanut soup is a Ghanaian dish. It used to be that the literature used to argue that the peanut was domesticated in the Americas and introduced into Africa. Then they said it was domesticated in Africa, introduced it to the Americas. Then it was changed again. Now it's changed again, so I don't know. You're on your own. Look at Wikipedia, because I can't figure it out. What it is, the last word I think is that it was domesticated in the Americas, introduced by the Portuguese. But it is extremely important in the diet, and that's the sacks of peanuts from an old photograph where they are transferring them. The other thing that is very important in the diet of the sub-Saharan Africa is the palm. And the palm oil is very, very important. It is extracted by women, and it is the equivalent of butter for us, or olive oil for us, cotton or seed oil, or whatever. It is the main cooking oil. And oil has 9 calories per gram. Carbohydrates and proteins have only 4 calories per gram. So oils and fats are very important in diets that are calorie deficient, which means that they're very important, particularly in diets for children. And they're extracted. You take the palm seeds, they are harvested, they're brought into the village, and then they are cooked, and the kernels are cooked, they're smashed, they're cooked, and the oil is skimmed off. And the oil then is used. This is selling the oil. It looks red, and it has a little bit of a grassy or biological or taste to it. And it is used in all of the cooking. It can also be fermented, and they'll collect the sugar from the palm tree itself and ferment it, and it makes a very sweet, light kind of wine that has a very pleasant taste. Cassava, which is manioc, it was domesticated in the Amazon basin. And was introduced here and is very popular in West Africa, and you will see cassava in the markets to this day. This cassava and plantain, both introduced. The reason that they really like cassava and plantain, even though those are carbohydrate foods, they don't have very much in the way of nutritional nutritional selection, is because they're very easy to pound and make into the fufu that they use as their basic staple. That is that mashed potato part that I was talking about. That is their major source of calories and carbohydrates. And fufu can be made from any kind of root crop, essentially, or plantains and bananas. It is pounded and cooked and actually fermented and then made into these little patties, so to speak, and that is what is served together with the stew. And you will see this if you keep your eyes open in Ghana. You will see this on the street of Ghana. The interesting thing about the fufu is that it is not chewed. It is swallowed. And children are admonished, don't chew it, swallow it. And they eat out of a communal bowl. This is obviously men eating separately from women. And they will take a bit of the fufu from that patty, and they will dip it with their hands into the bowl of the stew. They put it in their mouth and they swallow it. Now, you know, I was always taught that you got to chew your food in order for it to digest. And I tried to read some nutritional studies, and what I learned was that this fufu, this carbohydrate, will digest eventually in the stomach, but it will take a lot longer to digest than if you chew it, which means that you will be satisfied for longer. You won't get hungrier. And what they're doing is they're eating in the middle of the afternoon, and that is going to be lasting them. That's going to last until the next morning. So they're slowing the digestion down with this carbohydrate in order to provide energy later in the day and not to be hungry. And I think that's a very interesting take on it. This is a woman in the street in Ghana, in Tokoradi. I took her. She was very happy to have, she sells this food. She was very happy to have her pot photographed at herself. And what you see here, she's got the fufu in plastic bags in the bin on the side, and she's got the pot of the stew with the red palm oil. And if you look at it closer, she's got greens in it. This is where your vitamins and your nutritional variety comes in, and the major carbohydrates will come from the fufu. And this she had some meat in it, and it was pieces of animals that I don't normally eat, but I wouldn't buy. I mean, I buy in Latin America. I know what I'm doing. I know when I'm buying a taco on the street, what's in it. In Ghana, I don't know what's in this. So, and the locals love it. They just love it. This is for them. The original forms of agriculture are very intricate, and they are scientific, even though we don't always acknowledge it. But this is an old treatise on the way shea butter trees were intercropped with other plants in order to increase production of the land and the soil. And if you know what shea butter is, well, it's not a pretty story, because shea butter also comes from a seed, and it is edible. And until it was sold in the United States and in Europe as a cosmetic, it was eaten by children as a basic food. Fat, 9 calories per gram, remember? And it is things like this, the export crops, cash cropping of palm oil and shea butter that aggravates the nutritional stress of the children of Africa, because it is their food that is being exported in order to buy plastic bags, Cokes, chips, and other things. And this is what the hunger map of the world looks like, and that these export crops contribute to that world hunger. In return, what they're getting is imported goods, which are much more expensive. And what have you got for why this continues, why this imbalance and this level of malnutrition continues, is because imports are more profitable. Shea butter brings in money for the importer. There's a lack of access to land. Since 70% of agriculture is produced by women, these women don't own the land. Past slave raiding destabilized agriculture, and warfare destabilized agriculture, so that you didn't invest in trees and didn't invest in long-term crops. When food is exported, it's no longer available for people to eat. And instead of investing in local manufacturing, the money is sent, oil money is sent out of Africa and invested in the US stock market, the European stock market, and whatever. What is the problem is that there is no political will to change the system. And therefore, until there is a demand and a will, there isn't going to be any major policy changes. Thank you very much. And I'm going to leave this on for another, say, minute or so. This is some interesting books. Untapped is an expose of oil, the oil industry.
That they're underway in this presentation too. The Market Circle was this huge, big central area where all of the main roads of the city led towards this circle area. That being said, I'll show you a photograph of what it's looked like recently. They absolutely leveled the place and brought it down, so there's absolutely nothing there right now. That's not true. They are going through a reconstruction of it, and that's expected to be completed sometime in 2023. I'll show you sort of a little before and an after, as well as to what exactly looks like the area that you're going to see now. Originally, there will be a shuttle service in this port too. Originally, it was going to go to that Market Circle area, but there's really not a whole lot around there right now because of that construction. So the shuttle services are actually going to go a little bit further south, closer to the beach coastline. So we'll touch on that in this presentation too. But as I say, you can see the southern side of the city. You've got the beach coastline. There's some religious architecture too. The town of Takoradi, it doesn't have an abundance of major places of interest or sightseeing points of interest. So that's going to be key here too. I'll show you a few different areas. As I say, you've got Takoradi, you've got Sekundi, which sits about 7 miles or 11 kilometers away. And then we're also going to take a look further along the coastline to what was known as the Gold Coast for a long period of time, Cape Coast, the town of Elmina. There's a series of castles. There's actually 40 different castles and or fortifications under one UNESCO World Heritage listing, and it's a really significant area. It has a bit of a dark history there as well, with involvements of slave trade and colonialism and so forth, but we will take a look at that too. And there's also a national park area to the north. So, from the cruise port, this is where we're scheduled to arrive in. Now, I mentioned at the show last night that there is a map. It's actually for Abidjan. I'm going to show you a photograph, or so not a photograph, a map that was sent to me that took me about 45 minutes to figure out. I'll show you that for the next one. This one's a little bit more straightforward. You've got the cruise port down here. The main body of the downtown area of Takoradi is fairly close by. The Market Circle area, which I'll zoom in just a little bit to, is about 2.5 miles away from the port. But again, there's a major construction project, which I will talk about there. So instead, the shuttle services that are going to be offered are directed further down to the Best Western Plus Atlantic Hotel. Again, I'll show you another photograph, another map of that in just a little bit. It just brings you to a different area of the city for those independent travelers, a little bit further south, closer to the beach area of the city. From a topography standpoint, the city does rise up in a hillside a little bit further inland as well, so it does slope up and inland here as well. However, I mentioned that the city is really part of twin cities, officially titled Sekondi Takoradi. So Sekondi sits about 7 miles or 11 kilometers further up the coastline. You'll see a fishing harbour there. You'll also see Fort Orange. There's a couple of other historic sites there. Probably I would say there's a little bit more as far as significant points of interest in Sekondi than what there is in Takoradi. As I say, the major real feature or drawcard and central hub and way of life of Takoradi is this market circle, which unfortunately is undergoing quite a big construction process here. So we will cover these two and then look a little further afield. So Takoradi in itself, or really Sekondi Takoradi, it's the region's largest city here, and it's an industrial and commercial area. So you've got an understanding of population. You're coming into a city in 2 days' time with around 1 million people. Now the chief industries here, and that's a number that's changed significantly in the last 10 years. Now the chief industries here, you'll see a timber, there's cocoa processing, plywood, shipbuilding. There's been a big development of both the harbour areas and the railways along the coastline too. But recently, crude oil has had a huge impact and change on the landscape of this part of Ghana. Now the primary industry, however, though, is still fishing here. Sekondi, which is further along the coast, as I say, 7 miles or 11 kilometres. It is an older town. It's a little bit larger in its immediate size there. To the northeast, it's the site of the Dutch Fort Orange too, dating back to 1642, and the English Fort Sekondi from 1682. Now, it prospered very much once the railroad was built there in 1903 into the hinterland, which helped with the export of minerals and timber and other resources. Takoradi, though, in itself, where we arrive into, that was the site of some historic Dutch forts as well. But again, the major reason for its foundation is it is a deep water seaport. It was the first one really built in the country of Ghana, and that was in 1928. Now, during the Second World War as well, there was involvement here. RAF Takoradi was an important staging point. There was military base points here, aircraft that were destined to Egypt. There was South African squadrons based here as well. And there's actually a cemetery not too far away from the major downtown area of Takoradi, where a number of South African airmen have their final resting place. The town in itself, as I say, the population has very much been booming in the last 10 years, but just to take it a little bit further back, the two cities, Takoradi and Sekondi, they actually merged together, they combined as one in 1946, and on the 20th of November of 1969, the city also became the seat of the Roman Catholic Diocese of Takoradi Sekondi. Now the city currently has the nickname the Oil City of Ghana, and that is due to this massive discovery of oil in this western region of the country. Now it attracted migration from people all across the country and around the world as well, coming from other parts, not just of Africa, but other countries, other continents too, because of this big oil boom. So to understand the impact of that population, in 2010, the city's population was 250,000. Just 12 years later, it's 4 times. It's over 1 million people. So imagine the city you live in quadrupling in population in a decade. It's been a huge, huge influx, and that has been because of the oil boom here. Now, as far as the things to see and do, we're going to take a look at some of the sites around the town area. We do come quite close to the immediate fishing harbour area here too. I must stress, the downtown area of Takoradi, it's not flush with amazing places of interest and sightseeing points that you're going to mark off on a map. So Sekondi does have some other options as well. I mentioned Dutch Fort Orange there. There's also the old colonial railway station, the fishing harbour. But most visitors to Takoradi in itself, they tend to be business people, engineers, others involved in the oil workers and so forth. So because of that influx of business, you have seen this rapid growth in things like hotels, restaurants, and some resorts along the beachfront area, which is quite close to where we do come into. That being said, I've mentioned it a few times, I just wanted to show you some images of this area, the Takoradi Market Circle. Now, while operational, this has been a historic central focus point of this city for many decades. It's been this commercial and economic hub of this region. However, in recent years, there's been a lot of safety concerns that happened here. So the decision was made to it was this huge, big circular building right where all of the roads led to it. And because of electrical issues, safety issues, overcrowding, a range of other things, they decided to absolutely level the place. So
no more.
this project's been, I've actually been following this. There is a guy from Takoradi who runs a YouTube channel. He makes all of these videos, not just of Takoradi, but other areas of Ghana. Really fascinating. He films all of these videos in Ghana about construction projects and city development, and he talks about, you know, the geopolitical landscape and other areas. And I actually first learnt about this by watching his videos on YouTube, and he was talking all about this construction works, and lo and behold, this is sort of what it looks like right now. It will be a little bit more developed when we get there. This photo is now a couple of months old. This project's been going for a couple of years, however, and they're expecting it to not be fully rebuilt until mid to late 2023. So the reason for this, as I say, it was full of these combustible materials. There was illegal electrical connections. Traders didn't have permits to occupy floor space here, so there was overcrowding issues, and it was just very, very congested, and it became this dangerous place here. So it was decided to really redevelop this. The plan for it in the future is that this market area is going to have 2,408 stores.
Wow.
And that is with more space than it had before it was redeveloped. So that you can imagine what it was like. That seems like a big number, but that's to avoid overcrowding, to have over 2,400. But there's also going to be food courts, over 30 different restaurants as well. It is this big project that it's a 48 million euro project that's being undertaken here. As I say, it's going to take a little bit of time. So I wanted to stress this in this presentation because I know some of you may have done your research on this port of call, and this was really seen as a focal point of the city. It has been for many decades. It's just undergoing some works right now. Now, to head north of this area, this next one, I was not sure if I'd put it in or not because I can't guarantee the quality of it. But this is the next one, Monkey Hill. I was debating whether I should put this in here or not because I've been reading about this online. It's seen as this kind of monkey forest resort, this monkey habitat sitting just north of the city centre. Now, the story behind this place is that a colony of 50 monkeys actually took refuge here to the north of the city in this green space when the city expanded. Now, tourists began to absolutely flood this area because they wanted to come and see these monkeys and take photographs and so forth. And so the authorities quickly decided to protect this site. There's a couple of different primary species here. There's the Mona, there's the spot-nosed monkey as well. As I said, there's around 50 there, and it was an area recognized for its local